Hello and welcome to my next update video. In my last video, I showcased how I structured the enemies in order to keep them modular and customizable for the future. In the same way, I structured the techniques the player and enemies have in order to swiftly change and play around with the combat. In this video, I will go over the changes, improvements, and new ideas I have came to implement as I play-tested the current state of the game. Firstly, let's start with the enemy. Previously, the enemy only walked and moved around with no other functionality. The first thing I needed to do for the combat to be functional is to make the enemy attack. I have used the enemy detection component in order to give the enemy various behaviors such as line of sight or see-through walls vision, the ability to forget the player and stay off cliffs amongst other future ways enemies can interact. Second, I gave my first enemy two moves, a close-range spear combo and a long-range charge attack. As with any other part of this first enemy, the art is not final. This particular enemy follows the player but cannot jump, so when he loses sight, goes back to a wandering state. The behavior of the attacks is not finished as I have to refine it a lot more, since the enemy sometimes likes to use an attack while not in range but is good enough to test for now. I will revisit this once I start adding more enemies later. Now, let's talk about the player changes. While playtesting against multiple attacking enemies, I realized that the player has little to no way to deal with their attacks when surrounded besides dodging, which still works but only as a tool to disengage and flee a situation. When facing multiple enemies, the player has no option but to take damage while trying to execute techniques. While my original idea was always to overwhelm the player and pressure them with enemy-filled rooms, I felt they needed more ways to defend. My initial solution was to add a parry system which allows the player to negate all incoming damage from a hit in all directions and grant a small invulnerability frame window which granted the ability to react more aggressively to incoming damage without having to flee or reposition. This worked well at first, but I felt it needed something else, so I added a counterattack. After successfully parrying a hit, the player can press a button again in order to execute a counterattack in any direction. This counter currently deals no damage, consumes no energy and always stuns enemies. It is on a brief cooldown between parries and it has a small window of invincibility. However, if the player decides to counter, the full counter animation has full invincibility frames, allowing the player to briefly stop the enemies and give opportunity to attack. However, if the player misses the timing of the parry, they will have a small window of recovery at the end of the parry which allows enemy attacks to hit. With all this being said, I think the basics of the combat are mostly complete, even though the player only has two moves right now, which severely impacts how fun the combat feels, but since the animation of the moves takes me a long time, I'm keeping that for when the full core of the game is complete. In a different topic, while thinking more deeply about the techniques, I realized the initial idea of giving the player two slots for the arm and two for the legs greatly reduced the space for the player to more freely add techniques into their builds, locking them into having either two arm or leg techniques in every scenario. So I decided to rework this part by allowing the player to have any techniques in these four slots so they can, for example, make a kicking or punching only build. Lastly, I want to talk briefly about visual effects. I decided to create a component which allowed me to create effects in a customizable way in order to reuse them anywhere, and I realized how important they are the moment I added the first one. I can now add effects with custom rotations, colors, sizes, loop counts, positioning and speeds to spice my game even more. This is probably my favorite part so far, but unfortunately I have to stop making new effects for now while I finish the basics of my core loop. The next part of this journey will be to implement all the important menus and UI elements such as the minimap, pause, and options menus, the vendor sprite and menus in which to get new techniques and the player status windows. All of this is going to take a while as I need to design the general aesthetic of the UI, but with all this done, I can move to the hardest part of all for me, the procedurally generated rooms and transitions. I think that's all I have for this update. I don't know how long will the next part take, but I will update with whatever I have, even if it's a short video. Thanks for watching. Constructive feedback is always appreciated. See you in the next update.